The Raccoon, A Study in Animal Intelligence by H.B. Davis, Fellow in Clark University. Introduction. The aim of comparative psychology is, in the end, a classification of minds according to the kind and complexity of their thinking. As the criterion for this thinking, we are, of course, confined, in the case of animals, to what they do. We study animal behavior. We can observe what the animal does spontaneously in the wild, or in captivity, and how he reacts in experimental conditions. And nowhere is it more essential that these two sorts of observation should go hand in hand. No experimenter can feel perfectly sure that his conditions of experimentation are such as to show the animal at his best, without a most careful study of what the animal does or does not do in freedom, and of its own accord. And no student of animals in the wild can be sure that his interpretation of what he sees is the true one, unless the animal can be led to do the same sort of thing under fully known and controlled conditions. As Professor Jastrow 17 remarks, we can judge what animals think only by what they do, yet what they really do may be wholly different from what they apparently do. Trustworthy observations of the life of raccoons in the wild are not easy to obtain, because, perhaps, of their nocturnal habits, and little that is definite and of psychological interest is to be found in literature. Such personal observations as the writer has been able to make upon a dozen or more of these animals in captivity will presently be described. The experimental studies which follow have been, for the most part, of the general type of those made by Thorndike, Kinnaman, and others, and furnish, it is believed, a tolerable basis for the relative ranking of the raccoon with reference to the animals studied by these experimenters. It is perhaps fair to state also that the present study was begun in the early part of the year 1905, and was complete in its experimental part before the appearance of Professor Cole's study of the same animal in the May number of the Journal of Comparative Neurology and Psychology for the current year. The two papers are, nevertheless, to a considerable extent supplementary of each other, and an effort has therefore been made to correlate the results and to point out differences. Zoology. Geographical range and taxonomic relations. The raccoon inhabits the southern parts of the fur-bearing regions. Lewis and Clark found the animal at the mouth of the Columbia River. The Hudson Bay Company purchased skins as far north as the Red River, latitude 50 degrees. Dixon and Partlock obtained skins from the natives of Cook's River, latitude 60 degrees. On the Atlantic coast, Newfoundland is the northern limit. The animal ranges southward over nearly all of North America and South America as far as Paraguay. Matthew and Wortman, from the latest study of tertiary remains, place the immediate ancestor of the raccoon in the Oligocene period, and contrary to common opinion, make its affinity closer for the Canidae than the Ursidae. Something of its general zoological kinship is shown by the following summary of M. Watson's 37 study of the placentation of the raccoon. 1. Procyon agrees with all the other carnivora in which the organ has hitherto been examined in the possession of a zonary or annular placenta, and also in the mode of interlocking of the fetal and maternal portions of the placenta, and in the consequent deciduate character of that organ. 2. Procyon agrees with all the members of the plantigrade section, at the same time that it differs from those composing both the digitigrade and pinniped sections of the carnivora, inasmuch as at one spot the placenta presents a gap or deficiency, at which spot the placental structure is imperfect. 3. Procyon agrees with Canis at the same time that it differs from Felis in the absence of a continuous layer of decidua seratina from the uterine surface of the detached placenta. 4. Procyon differs from every other carnivore in the possession of placental vessels possessed of a structure hitherto only met with in the placenta of Coleopus hoffmanni among the Endantes. 5. Procyon differs from every other carnivore in the non-possession of an umbilical vesicle. 6. Procyon differs from all carnivores of which the young have been hitherto examined, inasmuch as the fetus is provided with a supernumerary cuticle or epitracheum, a structure which has only been met with in the young of certain members of other mammalian groups. The length of the period of gestation is not accurately known. Its culmination varies through April and May. The mother gives birth to 4 to 6, usually in a hollow tree. In the Berlin Tiergarten in the spring of 1871, a mother brought forth 5 young. The young have been reared in captivity in America in several instances. At birth, the young are small, about the size of a half-grown rat. It is asserted that they are born blind like some other carnivora. General observations. In popular opinion, both among the Indians and whites, the raccoon has a high reputation for cunning and adroitness. Reports of the Bureau of American Ethnology, 6, 7, have preserved for us many of the Indian folk stories, in which the raccoon figures either as the chief actor of the story or else the subject of a parallel story in which the doings of some other animal of like cunning have been transferred to it. All these stories, from whatever source, have but one theme, namely, the subtlety and cunning of the animal, which a short acquaintance will render as clearly apparent as it ever could have been to the aborigines. Food. Omnivorousness has apparently had much to do with the development of the raccoon's hunting habits. He plunders the farmer's cornfield, he lifts the eggs from the woodpecker's nest, he gathers many kinds of nuts, grubs for roots, digs out turtles and frogs, goes berrying in the proper season, robs the chicken roosts, is a good fisherman and clam digger. All these and 100 other activities combine to show the animal's great adaptability in the securing of a varied dietary. Confinement confirms the characteristics manifested in the wild. The raccoon seldom sulks when the table is spread. He never questions the cooking. He eats a good meal and, given 30 minutes for refreshment and sleep, is ready for another as bountiful as the first. Fruit, bread, jellies, honey, sweetmeats, fish, mollusks, small crustaceans, rodents, and some green vegetables give sufficient variety for the selection of proper foods for feeding in captivity. Raccoons, however, adapt themselves to some one article of food, and as soon change to any other which may be forthcoming. I have fed them entirely on dog biscuit, then put them on a meat diet, changed to a variety diet, and then returned to the dog biscuit, without much apparent loss of appetite, but the animal thrives best on a mixed diet. The particular conditions of feeding during experimentation will be spoken of later. Page 463. Physical characters. The mobility of the fingers, with the sharp and partly retractile claws, which fit the hand for climbing as well as for other purposes, the bushy tail present as a balancing organ, and often slightly prehensile, the broad, tuberculate molars, not thin and with cutting edges as in the purely cat tribe, the pointed and double-edged canines, are all indicative of the physical resourcefulness of this animal, as well as its ability to hold its own against all comers of equal size. The raccoon climbs the bare steam pipes in the laboratory with as much ease as though they were the trees of the forest. He travels along the electric wire at the ceiling as if it were the branch of a tree, and he on the underside of it. The prehensile and balancing characters of the tail appear whenever the animal attempts to climb, or stand on the hind feet in a place where the footing is uncertain, or when it is climbing a vertical surface, in which case the tail is used to steady the body in a woodpecker uses his while chipping the bark of the tree. Significance of the name Loter, the washer. The nicknames which the raccoon has received are closely associated with his observed habits in the wild. Indigenous people called him the scratcher, the oyster eater. In Venezuela, the Spanish local name is fox, wash thy hand. The name washer comes from the animal's habit of washing its food. Beckman gives an account of one which used to amuse himself by washing various odds and ends in a bucket of water. An old pot handle, a snail shell, or anything of the sort would do, but the thing he loved the best was an empty bottle. Clasping it in his forepaws, he would waddle slowly to the bucket with the bottle clasped close to his breast, and then roll it and rinse it in the water. If anyone ventured to disturb him, he was furious and threw himself upon his back, clinging so tightly to his beloved bottle that he could be lifted by it. The Journal of Comparative Neurology, December 1892, page 157, cites the case of a tame raccoon which was accustomed to carry his food across his cage to wash it, and if the particles were too small, so that he ate them up on the way to the water pan, he nevertheless continued to wash with nothing in his paws. Later, however, he failed to carry the smaller particles. Footnote. Audubon remarks that he never saw his tame coon wash its food. In view of this most characteristic habit escaping the notice of the great naturalist, we can but remark in passing on the incompleteness of data which any single student may hope to secure from his own observations alone. The reason for the washing of the food has been variously assigned. By some it is attributed to a lack of saliva. Others say that since the raccoon obtains his food largely from the water, the washing must mean that the animal convinces itself by the washing that it has made a fresh catch. Still others think that the animal washes its food merely to clean or soften it, though the process turns out to be anything but a cleanly one with coons in captivity. Each of these explanations may and probably does have an inkling of the truth, but neither singly nor together do they make clear the origin of the purpose of this interesting and puzzling, though long observed, habit. If water is not provided, the raccoon takes the food to the dry basin and there repeats his ancestral washing. A basin and water lacking, he sits on his haunches and rubs the food between his dry paws. If the key to the problem lies somewhere back in the long list of ancestral traits, we may hope that some animal under observation will yet offer us the proper solution. Dexterity in the use of paws. The cleverness with which the raccoon uses his paws is seen in the facility with which it will catch insects in their flight, an amusement which appeals to the young ones, and also in the marked ability to pick up minute morsels of food and carry them to its mouth. Ainsworth Davis, 11, remarks that these peculiar powers of manipulation as regards the organs of prehension by which the food is seized and carried to the mouth are indicative of intelligence above the average in the animals in which they manifest themselves. This dexterity is, however, in large degree a matter of practice. When raccoons first come in from the wild and have gotten accustomed to take food from the keeper's hand, the paws are moved simultaneously to secure the morsel. Perfect coordination as to direction in the movements either of both paws or a single paw is lacking. Through practice, however, the animals soon acquire the ability to use each forepaw independently and are finally able to use one paw with greater quickness and accuracy than they formerly used the two. Burke's 8. Exposition of the development of hand movements in the child would seem to throw light on this observation, for, as he remarks, the progress in evolution of hand movements in the biologic scale has been from extreme fewness in number to infinite variety, from simplicity to complexity, from clumsy inaccuracy to precision, from simultaneous associations to those which constitute long series in sequence, from the general to the specialized. Ferret shows in one of his works that the ability to move one hand without the other is small among the imbecile class. This tendency of the imbecile class to simultaneous movements suggests atavism, since simultaneity is the dominating law of the fundamental movements and succession is the human characteristic of accessory movements. Simultaneous movements of the hand suggests reversion to the conditions when the hand was a forelimb. If then these conclusions are true, we may here also find some justification for placing the raccoon above the average in the scale of intelligence. Curiosity. While a perfected hand is without doubt a true index of intelligence, it is at best a physical and indirect one. A much more immediate and essential symptom is the exhibition of lively curiosity. in psychological terms, spontaneous attention and the instinct to investigate. Without it, active intelligence is out of the question. The raccoon is an animal which displays this quality in a high degree. Its curiosity contributes to the development of its intelligence, while at the same time it often becomes a source of serious lesson teaching. The animal would scarcely fall into the lure of the baited trap unless led on by its curiosity when once the scent of possible food had aroused it. The trapper takes advantage of this when he wraps a piece of tinfoil around the trencher of the trap, which is then placed 2 or 3 inches under water, where it ripples a little, covering all but the foil with leaves or grass. The glittering foil prompts the raccoon to investigate. Sometimes the raccoon manifests a knavery which leads to a just punishment. Groos, 16, quotes from Beckman the following account of a tame raccoon which was especially attached to a badger in the same enclosure. On hot days, the badger was accustomed to take his nap in the open air under the shade of an alder. Then the mischievous coon found his opportunity, but as he feared the badger's bite, he carefully kept his distance, satisfying himself with touching his victim softly in the rear at intervals. This was enough to keep the sleepy fellow awake and reduce him to despair. In vain he snapped at his tormentor. The wary coon trotted to the edge of the enclosure, and scarcely had the badger composed himself before he was at his old tricks. One day he was too severe with the badger, which went off growling and rolled into his hole. After a while he put his head out on account of the heat and went to sleep thus entrenched. The coon saw that he could not expect much attention from his friend under these circumstances, and was about to set off for home when the badger suddenly awoke and stretched his narrow red mouth wide open. This so surprised our hero that he turned back to examine the rows of white teeth from every point of view. The badger continued immovable in the same position, and this excited the coon's curiosity to the highest pitch. At last he ventured to reach out and tap the badger's nose with his paw. In vain, there was no change. This behavior of his comrade was inexplicable. His impatience increased every moment. He must solve the riddle at any cost. He wandered about for a while, apparently undecided how best to pursue the investigation, but reaching a decision, at last he thrust his pointed snout in the badger's open jaws. The rest is not difficult to imagine. The jaws closed, and the raccoon, caught in the trap, squirmed and floundered like a captive rat. After a mighty scuffling and tugging, he at length succeeded in tearing his bleeding snout from the cruel teeth of the badger, and fled precipitately. The lesson lasted a long time, and after it, whenever he went near the badger's kennel, he involuntarily put his paw over his nose. The above minutely detailed description shows how dominant the element of curiosity is, and in addition there appears a tenacity of memory plus something almost reflective, which found its expression in a quite fully developed new method of defense, namely, that of placing the paw above the snout when near the enemy. Raccoons, when not too wild, push their paws into all the pockets of the keeper which are accessible, and lift all movable parts of their cage and try to find out what is in or under them. Nothing escapes their notice in the long run. They therefore lend themselves readily to training or experimentation. Details illustrative of this last will follow in a later section. Vocalizations. An interpretation of the vocalizations of the raccoon is possible only in terms of accompanying circumstance. The cry of the young for the mother is often so nearly like that of the human infant that unless one were accustomed to hear it, it would easily be so mistaken. A low growl, like that of the bear in quality, warns off the intruder. This is also given when in possession of food and fearing its loss. When the coon springs forward to bite, there is the accompanying snarl resembling in pitch and quality that of other members of the dog and bear family. A common call in the woods is in character a purr, which approaches very nearly in quality and carrying powers to the tremulous note of the tree frog. It lacks a little of the shrillness of the frog note, and rises in pitch when uttered by the young instead of the adult. When the mother is nursing her young, she gives forth a note which is almost a perfect imitation of the sound of a hummingbird's wings as it pauses before the flower. The two sounds are so nearly alike in character that I was myself deceived many times before I was able to locate it in the cage rather than in the vines which grew in the rear. The mother's warning note in danger is almost inaudible. If one attempts to sound the letter M short and explosively with closed lips, at the same time allowing the air to be driven in short blasts through the nostrils, a very fair reproduction of the sound results. Although the note is very low, I have never seen a young one fail to recognize it, even in the midst of the fiercest tussle of its play. A note quite frequently heard in captivity, either while at play or indeed when angered, can be very nearly reproduced by placing the lips in the position for whistling, and uttering the oo of boot, followed by f, oof. This vocalization must also be given explosively. This and the note above require some practice to imitate perfectly. That the vocalizations of the mother possess great significance, although differing but slightly in quality, is shown by the experience with number 3 when she was captured with her young. The mother was taken from the tree first and placed in a large box. When number 5 was captured and pushed into the box with his mother, he made a vicious attack upon her, but she simply gave out a low purring note, and the young fellow immediately snuggled up to his mother and became quiet. Fear. When the raccoon is afraid, it trembles, crouches into some corner, backs off, and frequently turns and runs. Sometimes the animal stands perfectly still with the head lowered and back hunched, looking at and following every movement in the direction of the cause of fright. The former attitude is shown in the animal at the left in Figure 7, Plate 2. The latter position is shown in Figure 4 of the same plate. Often a low vocalization or a diminutive grunt accompanies every movement. Sometimes a coon just in from the wild will try to cover its head and thus, ostrich-like, render itself free from all danger. Fright is usually accompanied by a relaxation of the anal and urinary muscles, resulting in defecation and discharge of urine. Greed. That the raccoon is greedy goes without saying. An animal whose bare existence usually depends on getting all that can be secured is so instinctively. A raccoon will gather in one place all the food he can secure and sitting down upon it endeavor to keep all others away until the food is completely devoured. The method of dislodgement is to back in, push the would-be glutton from his spoil, and then reaching under the body pull the food to the new possessor. Sometimes there is a direct attack and scuffle. Food is not the only bone of contention. One animal will try to keep the others from the water basin. This activity, however, may change to a species of play. If the food is being given to the whole pack in small pieces, some will take their portion and stuff it in their mouths and return again and again until the mouth is filled to its utmost capacity. Often they will even throw away for the time being what is given them in order to be in the scuffle for the last rations. These activities are simply indications of the adaptation to wild conditions where periods of want follow hard upon those of satiety. Play. The plays of the raccoon might be classified as 1. Simple activity, 2. Feeding and fighting plays. Plays of simple activity are those in which the animal plays for the most part by itself, as when it takes a small stick or wisp of straw, and rubbing it in the direction of its longer axis between the forepaws, raises its paws above its head during the rubbing until finally it falls or rolls over backwards. Catching a dangling rope with the teeth, or seizing a flying trapeze with all 4 paws and swinging on it, or going through gymnastics on a horizontal bar, also belong in this class. One of the raccoons, after jumping from the roof of the inner cage to a flying trapeze, swung for a few minutes and then fell some 3 or 4 feet to the floor of the cage, landing on her back. As if angered by the fall and giving the trapeze the credit for the mishap, she climbed to the top of the inner cage again and attempted to wrench and gnaw it from its fastenings. Here would seem to be the beginning of an association of immediate cause and effect. One of the young coons used to sit at night in front of the swing door to one of the sleeping boxes and raise it up and let it fall for half an hour at a time. I was never able to discover any particular reason for this activity, though there may be an element of pleasure in the rhythmic sound produced. A horse will sometimes move a carriage against its cramped wheel in such a way as to produce a rhythmic sound apparently for that purpose. Sometimes a coon will sit on its haunches and beat a tattoo with its forepaws on the floor in front, with no other apparent purpose than its own amusement. Tipping over the water basin as soon as it was filled was indulged in by both old and young until I was compelled to put the water in an earthen jar, too large and heavy to be tipped over. Catching flies from the walls of the sleeping boxes is a favorite amusement on sultry summer afternoons. Twice I noticed the young ones in the act of sucking their paws after the manner of bears. Among the plays which seem to be related to feeding and fighting, we find the raccoon dipping its paws into the water basin and then thrusting them while still wet into the face of a pursuer, also rubbing the dry and empty paws in the same fashion as when washing food in water. This is often resorted to as a form of amusement during the time between feeding periods. Sometimes one animal will take a piece of food and try to conceal it or run away with it, while others follow and try to secure it. This kind of play takes place when there is plenty of food and all have satisfied their appetite for the time being, since the food itself will often be left for some minutes before being eaten. The fighting plays appear also in the tussle of the young with each other, old ones among themselves, or the mother with her young. If two animals begin a tussle, they usually stand off facing each other with head down, back humped, and paws extended in front. There are 2 or 3 preliminary advances and retreats, and then comes the set to, when, very much as in the catch-as-catch-can wrestling, they seize each other with the forepaws and twist and turn in the attempt to throw each other over backwards, and thus expose the throat to attack. Once down, there will be a playful use of teeth, accompanied by more or less vocalization, followed by a quick breakaway and an immediate or delayed renewal of the tussle. If the young ones begin such play with each other, it often happens that the old ones begin a similar match among themselves. This last may be an instance of imitation, and will receive consideration later. When one of the young ones attempted to hang from a low trapeze and have a good swing, another young one came along and, thrusting his nose into the gymnast's stomach, pushed him to the floor and then took the place on the trapeze himself, throwing back his head and playfully growling at the discomforted fellow, who usually took this as a signal to retaliate in a similar attack. I gave them a rubber ball one day. At first they tried to eat it, but when they discovered that it would roll, the play began in earnest. One would back off with the ball between his paws, while another would try to secure possession of it. Its attractiveness lasted but a short time, however, and after the first few days they never played with the ball again. If the mother and young are approaching each other from opposite directions, the mother will sometimes catch the hind foot of the young one just as she is passing and turn it over on its back with a quick flip. The young one then attempts to defend itself with its feet in air, or by curling up against the mother, who tries to rub its stomach with her nose. I find this seizing by the hind foot while bearing off with the shoulders to be a very common method of fighting among mature raccoons. The raccoon also fights on its back, so we probably have here the beginnings of a proper training for future struggles where the life of the animal is at stake. Sometimes the young ones by themselves, but more often the mother, would catch one by the tail or hind foot, either with the paws or teeth, and drag it backwards across the cage. This usually resulted in a tussle, in which the victim on its back tried to seize the head and neck of the attacker with its forepaws and pull it down within reach of its jaws. The study of Dr. Robinson, 30, on ticklishness has evident bearing on this kind of play, and from him I quote, "Not only every part of our physical frame, but every instinct and appetite either is or has been at some past stage of human history necessary to secure the survival or prosperity of the race. The baring of the teeth, the defensive movements of the limbs, the attempts to protect regions from attack as neck, armpits, and groin are characteristic of tickling pursued to a vigorous outcome. We are dealing with but one type of ticklishness, viz., that which is especially present in early life, when it is plainly associated with a natural desire or appetite which is intermittent, needing the subject to be in a receptive mood, and which is always associated with laughter and play. This form has a social significance, which the others, as irritability of the mucous membranes on the palate and in the nostrils, or the palmar surfaces or soles of the feet, have not. The more ticklish regions of the body, both in man and animals, are chiefly the armpits and contiguous parts, the ribs especially where they join the abdomen, the front and sides of the neck, especially just above the collarbone, the upper and inner parts of the thigh, over the region known to anatomists as Scarpa's triangle, and on the limbs, the parts behind the knees and in front of the elbow. 3 points are plain. 1. All the young creatures which obviously take pleasure in being tickled, which have the appetite in a marked degree, are naturally playful, and appear to take a special delight in romps of a rough-and-tumble character, which are essentially mock battles. 2. The regions which are especially ticklish and most carefully defended in these games are those which, in a serious fight with formidable teeth and claws, would prove most vulnerable. 3. All these animals, with the exception of man, are armed in this way, and settle their differences by adroit use of such weapons. Hence, a young dog or ape which, in the innumerable sham fights of its youth, learns to defend the axillae where a single bite might sever the axillary artery, the neck with the carotids and windpipe just under the surface, the flanks and borders of the ribs, where a comparatively slight tear lays open the abdominal cavity, and the groin, where the great femoral vessels lie close to the skin, would, without doubt, be vastly better equipped for the fierce combats for supremacy in afterlife than an animal which had not undergone the same elaborate training. Warfare becomes more and more a matter of education, tactics, and strategy, and less a matter of brute force, as the scale of intelligence is ascended. Innumerable feints and methods of attack appear which are countered by a series of guards equally elaborate. Strategy depends upon experience, adroitness, and adaptiveness, and not upon inherent instincts. It must be learned. And a young animal which had not the advantage of an education derived from sham fights in early youth would be as helpless, when brought face to face with an experienced foe, as one of us who knew nothing of fisticuffs or swordplay would be, if he were pitted against a practiced pugilist or fencer. One of the most interesting observations upon the play of these animals was made during the first week after I secured the mother and her 3 young ones. When no one was looking on, they used to sally forth from the little inside sleeping boxes into the yard of the large cage. The mother was always leading, and each little fellow followed with one of his forepaws on the hip of the fellow just ahead. This seemed like a sort of follow-the-leader game. In rare instances, there appeared activities which might be interpreted as having sexual significance. Such would be those where one animal seized the other by the thighs with the forepaws and held it thus for some time, or simply dragged it about the cage after having thus seized it. Hibernation. Attention has already been called to the ability of the raccoon to adapt itself to variations of diet. A study of its life during the first and second winters seems to point to a similar adaptability to prevailing differences of temperature. The characteristics of the hibernating period, as slight beating of the heart, apparent cessation of respiration, loss of fat accumulated during the summer and autumn in supplying the constant demand in the production of heat energy, the necessity of seclusion lest the shock of sudden waking with its heavy demand upon circulation and respiration should cause immediate death. These are all familiar to the student of the habits of mammals undergoing the profound sleep of the hibernating period. The raccoon, however, does not sleep as profoundly as the bear. The constant loss of moisture compels it to come out of winter quarters and seek the water. In the wild, when they come out, they sometimes travel for a mile or more, either returning to their own den or turning in with another coon, with which they pass the remainder of the period. During the first winter, my animals went into hibernation in an apparently normal way. They used to come out about once in 2 weeks for water. At such times, they seemed to be getting weaker and weaker. Their actions were those of animals which had been in one position a long time, so that the trembling of the body and tottering gait might have been due to a cramp from which they had but just found release. On coming out permanently in the spring, one of the animals was taken sick. She lost all her strength. If she attempted to climb or stand up on her hind legs, she would fall to the floor in a helpless condition. The enteric plug of the coon is not as large and hard, proportionally, as that of other hibernating animals, but this animal acted as if poisoned by the retention of the feces and urine. Proceeding to treatment on the basis of this diagnosis, she made a quick recovery after her relief from the disturbing cause. During the first winter, the cage was out of doors. During the second winter, since living in the city rendered it impracticable to keep the cage outside, it was placed in the basement of a stable. This was commodious and well lighted, and without artificial heat. The differences in temperature between inside and outside during the season were of but a few degrees, and yet none of the raccoons went into hibernation. Two others which came in, one about the middle of the winter and another almost at the end, went through the normal process of gradually waking. This failure to hibernate has thus far shown no determinant effect. In fact, the physical condition of the animals seems higher since they have been able to avoid the usual depletion of the period. The lower latitudes of the geographical range of the raccoon offer conditions of such a character that hibernation is unnecessary. But the interesting feature of this observation was that so small differences of temperature seem to have been sufficient to cut out the period and habit altogether. Disposal of excrement. Raccoons in the wild drop the feces wherever they happen to be and leave them exposed. This is one of the means used by hunters for tracking them or determining their presence in a locality. It is also likely that from the observation of the feces thus dropped, the indigenous people acquired sufficient knowledge of their feeding habits to attribute to them the conversations on the effects of certain wild fruits, which we find in the indigenous people's folk stories. At first, my animals in captivity followed the habit of the woods, exercising no selection of place for the deposit of the feces. When confined in a small cage of two compartments, an upper and a lower, they soon made a choice, one of a corner in the lower compartment, the other of the entire upper compartment. When put into the larger cage, they gradually formed the habit of depositing behind the inner cage in a narrow but somewhat concealed passageway. When moved into a still larger cage with other animals, where the floor was covered with sawdust, all soon selected a definite part of the floor and began covering the excrement. The 7 animals which are now together in a still larger place of confinement have 2 places within the area, and at one of the other of these they all, with but rare exception, deposit, urinate, and cover. Something similar, so far at least, as regards the constant use of a particular place is not infrequently to be observed in the case of other animals. I am not aware, however, that the taking on of the covering habit had been noticed. In any case, the observation is a most interesting one. We have a stereotyped form of behavior which, if observed in its final steps alone, would unhesitatingly be pronounced instinctive, actually acquired in a comparatively short time and under observation. That it is a response to some special feature or features of the life in confinement can hardly be doubted, and the question is natural as to how far other stereotyped and seemingly instinctive forms of activity in these and other animals are likewise plastic and owe their seeming fixity to the fixity of the conditions in which the animals usually pass their lives. We may even ask the further question whether man's greater plasticity is not in large measure the reflection of his complex and varying environment, rather than a special endowment. These questions are, of course, more difficult to answer than to ask, and it is not our purpose here to try to answer them. Even the attempt to fix upon the special features of the life in captivity that are responsible for the change must be largely conjectural. The uniformity of place selected may have an element of imitation in it, to be discussed later, or may be the result of an association by which the odor of the excrement tends, when the time of excretion is near, to suggest the act. The disagreeable association of odor with no possibility of escape for an animal not accustomed to its presence may account for the covering which conceals what cannot be left behind and thus out of sight. Temperament. Whoever has observed animals, either wild or tame, for any considerable time, sooner or later discovers that they, like the human animal, have widely differing temperaments, and manifest varying characteristics, which may depend in part on physical organization, but find proximate cause in changes in weather conditions, food, or other disturbing factors not so readily classified. While it may be less possible even than with man to select distinctive physical marks of temperament, such as the color of the eyes, hair, and skin, temperature, character of the pulse beat, and quality of the flesh, yet impetuousness of action, sluggishness, cruelty, ferocity, solitary or gregarious tendencies, moroseness, stupidity, non-irritability, and such like, when observed, go far towards giving a more perfect understanding of animal life. Indeed, these temperamental differences are often as well defined as in the case of human individuals. Some animals are of the nervous, others of the phlegmatic, and still others of the bilious type. if we may be allowed to designate them thus for purposes of description. Those of the most purely nervous type are much more active, make many more movements in experimental work, and yet accomplish the task in the same or less time than their more slowly moving, accurate, and phlegmatic fellows. A blow with a stick may mean to one animal a never-to-be-forgotten injury, while to another it merely serves as a corrective. Raccoon number 3, whose photograph appears in figures 4 and 11 at the right of figure 7 in plate 2, has never ceased to remember a blow which was given in a thoughtless moment, when the master lost his temper. She is always suspicious, and makes use of every opportunity to spring at any person, for all alike are enemies. She will, however, stand up on a box at the opposite side of the room, or even in the middle of the floor, and beg for food, as if she were the most affectionate of all. Figure 11, plate 2. Go near, and you are met with a growl, a spring, and sharp teeth. Figure 7, plate 2, at the right. Figures 3, 6, and 10, plate 2, represent an animal at almost the opposite extreme. She has been punished for wrongdoing, but never resents it. She will come to you, sit on your knee, climb to your shoulder for food, and if she thrusts her pointed nose into your face, she never offers to bite, snarl, or intentionally scratch you. Figure 1 is much of this same type, but being blind, he must be touched gently, as he can only thus distinguish friend from foe. Figure 2 shows an animal which was at the first timid and somewhat morose. For more than a year it was impossible to either coax or whip him into obedience. Then suddenly, without any apparent cause, he changed entirely. He began to climb into the lap, to eat from the hand, and to do as was desired. He seems still to hold unpleasant memories of a stick, which his master seldom carries now, and the passing of the stick may account for the absorption of the field by new and more pleasant associations. A change of scene seems to affect all alike, save one. It usually takes about 3 weeks for them to settle comfortably into new quarters, and go about their experimental tasks. When they were moved into the university building, I was not prepared to find them refusing to work, even at their most familiar tests, for more than 10 weeks. Footnote. A series of extraneous disturbances to which they were subjected during the earlier part of their stay in the university building had much to do with their long period of nervousness. They even refused to take their food from the hand, save one, as noted above. This is an old coon. Fresh changes may arise, but she is never disturbed. She goes about as if all the new were old. I have never been able to get her full history, and so suspect that she may have been in captivity before, and possibly have escaped. The field of observation in temperamental differences is a large one, but it is fertile with clues to all kinds of experimental problems, and its possible effects have, perhaps, been too little regarded by experimenters generally, especially when experiments have been made upon but a few individuals. Experiments. Animals experimented upon. It is hardly possible to give more than an approximate estimation of the age of the animals which I have had and now have, in view of the fact that they were all secured from the wild and so fully grown as to put accurate figures out of the question. The figures are simply estimates based upon close observation by myself and others acquainted with the life of the raccoon in the wild. They are rough approximations, but are believed to be not far from the truth. Number 1. Female, 4½ years, trapped. Number 2, female, 4½ years, trapped. Number 3, female, 3 years, taken from tree with young. Number 4, male, 1½ years, young of number 3. Number 5, male, 1½ years, young of number 3, died February 1907. Number 6, male, 1½ years, young of number 3. Number 7, female, age unknown, old, bought, perhaps previously in captivity. Number 8, male, 2 years, obtained from Pennsylvania, escaped, recaptured. Number 9, male, 2 years, obtained from Pennsylvania, escaped. Number 10, male, 2 years, obtained from Pennsylvania, escaped. Number 11, male, 3 years, trapped, escaped, recaptured, died. Number 12, female, 2½ years, trapped, died. The ages given are either for the summer of 1907 or the age at death or escape. I have had to do with about equal numbers of each sex, and have not been able to determine that sex makes much difference in the matter of intelligence. It is rather the individual temperament and character which count. Housing. During the 3 years which have thus far been given to a continuous observation of these animals, their quarters have been changed and enlarged as numbers increased and experimental conditions made greater demands for space. In the beginning, the first 2 animals were kept in an enclosure of chicken wire fastened to a wooden framework 6 foot by 4 foot by 6 foot. The wire was reinforced by interwoven iron wire of number 18 gauge. Inside this enclosure was a small, 2-storied closed cage in which the animals passed the nights and also hibernated during the first winter. In the spring, the 3rd animal which was trapped, number 11 in the above list, escaped from this cage and thus made necessary the construction of larger and more secure housing. A cage 7 foot square was constructed, with a wooden framework, which supported heavy iron screens of 1.5-inch diagonal mesh, such as is commonly used in banking houses. The rear of this cage was shut in by a series of 4 2-storied sleeping boxes, so arranged as to be occupied singly or all thrown into communication. This offered facilities for the isolation of any particular animal during experimental periods, and at the same time made it possible to gratify the animal's propensity to crawl in and out through dark and light places. The 3rd move was into an enclosure inside the university buildings. This is 14 foot square, constructed on 2 sides of sheathing to a height of 7 foot, the remaining space above being shut in by heavy poultry wire of 1/2-inch mesh. The inside walls of the building form the other 2 sides of the enclosure. 2 large windows look out on the street, which, however, is some distance away. The wire and the boxes and stands placed on the floor provide opportunity for exercise in climbing about. Feeding. The sorts of food upon which the raccoon will thrive have already been mentioned, page 450. In the matter of feeding 3 meals a day, and regularity has been the rule. Bostock's 6 days feeding and 1 day's fasting has also been adopted. This equalizes somewhat the great differences between the conditions of food getting in the wild and in captivity. Insofar as possible, the times of experimentation have coincided with the feeding periods. In experiments like those in color discrimination, where variation in natural illumination was necessary, there was a departure from this rule. The ration has been fairly uniform. Neither a condition of satiety nor hunger has been sought, but such as seemed on close observation to be that of highest efficiency. It is somewhat significant that, after a period of work, the coons usually retired to the sleeping boxes and took a nap of greater or less duration. Whether this was an alternation of sleeping and eating, or one of work and sleep, is not clear. Probably all 3 factors entered in some degree. Apparatus. In the experiments to be described, the food was placed inside a wooden box, 15 inches by 11 inches by 12 inches, in the front of which was a door 6 inches by 5 inches, which the animal was required to open in order to secure the food. See Plate 2, Figure 5. The door was adjusted to open outward when it was once released by the locking device. The simple devices used were 1. A button. This was so placed and adjusted that it must be thrust downward through an angle of about 40 degrees. The button was placed at the upper right-hand corner of the door during one series of trials, and at the upper left-hand corner during a second series. 2. A vertical gate hook. This was placed at the middle of the door. It was adjusted to move to the right in one series of trials, and to the left in another series. 3. A bolt. This was of the common slide bolt pattern. It was placed at the left of the door and adjusted to slide to the left. 5. A T-latch. This was placed vertically at the middle of the door and adjusted to move to the right in one series of trials, and to the left in another series. 6. A lift latch. This was placed at the right of the door and adjusted to be moved through an angle of 90 degrees in order to release the door. 7. A plug. This was placed on the top of the box and so connected with a bolt inside the box that pulling the plug drew up the bolt, and so released the door. 8. A horizontal hook. This was placed at the left of the door and had to be lifted in order to release the door. It was the same hook that had been used in the vertical position. 9. A bear-down lever. This was placed at the right end of the box and adjusted to fasten the door on the inside. Lifting the inner end about an inch released the door. 10. A push bar. This was placed at the right end of the box. It was adjusted to fasten the door on the inside. A thrust of about 3/4 of an inch released the door. Beside these simple locking devices, which were used singly, the door for certain experiments was held by 2 or 3 of such simple fastenings. These will be referred to as groups. The elements of the groups were familiar to the animals from their use singly, and could, of course, be operated in any order. The groups were constituted as follows. 11. Group 1 consisted of 2 buttons, one at the upper right-hand corner of the door and one at the upper left-hand corner. 12. Group 2 was the same as Group 1, with the vertical gate hook added at the middle of the door between the buttons. The combinations, like the groups, were built up from the simple locking devices already familiar, but they differed from the groups in requiring that the elements should be operated, if at all, in a definite order. 13. Combination 1 consisted of 4 locks, a bear-down lever at the right end, a plug at the top, a button at the left of the door, and a vertical hook placed a little to the right of the middle of the door. The entire mechanism was so constructed that each simple lock, while a part of the combination, yet fastened the door by itself. The outside and inside views of this combination are given in figures 5 and 8, plate 2. When the lever numbered 1 was properly worked, it fastened itself so that it could not be moved back again and refasten the door, and at the same time made it possible to pull up the plug 2. When the plug had been pulled, the button 3 could be turned, and when the button had been turned, the hook 4 could be released, and the door would fly open. 14. Combination 2 consisted also of 4 elements, a push bar at the left end, a bolt at the left of the door to be thrust to the left, a button at the right of the door to be thrust downward, and a kind of hook, known at the hardware dealers as an inside blind catch, placed at the top of the door to be thrust to the right. The internal character of the mechanism was similar to that of combination 1. In this combination, as in the other, the elements were so arranged as to prevent the accidental relocking of any one of them after it had been operated in its proper turn. All the simple locking devices were set to move at between 300 GRMs and 400 GRMs. It was not possible to adjust them accurately in the case of the combinations, on account of the combined lever system and the crudeness of the construction. In the combinations, therefore, there was much variation in the amount of force necessary to move the fastenings. Method of work. Food was placed inside the box, the door closed and fastened by whatever device was in use at the time. The closed box was then placed in the cage and the animal turned loose to investigate. No other incentive was given than curiosity and moderate appetite, possibly intensified by the smell of the food concealed in the box. At the first, the box was not fastened to the floor, but it soon became necessary to fasten it, because of the rough handling it received unless so secured. The times required for the working of the fastenings were taken with a stopwatch reading to fifths of seconds, but the curves presently to be considered were all plotted from the nearest readings in seconds. The time taken included the entire period during which the animal was in contact with the locking device. If his attention was distracted, note was taken of the same, and such and all known sources of error eliminated from the learning curves. Each animal was given 40 trials on each locking device. These 40 trials were not always consecutive, because the animal often left the box after 10 or 20 trials. Sometimes this was due to a satiety of food. At others, it was due to lack of interest. A period of several hours or even an entire day might thus intervene at times between 2 consecutive trials. The successful operation of the mechanism in 1 second was taken as the standard for perfection in the case of the simple locks. In the case of the combinations, the animal was considered up to standard when it worked the apparatus 10 times in succession without error in the order or failure in muscular adjustment to the different locking devices. The times of such standard performances was uniformly about 5 seconds. Variations in the attack on locks. The tests indicate that each animal shows some individuality in the method of opening locks, though different methods are employed at different times. Sometimes the variation appears in the way in which the animal approaches the box, and this often involved a characteristic method of attack. Again, in the order of working a group, and often in bringing into action not only the forefeet, but hind feet, nose, and even the weight of the body. Age also makes a difference. Old coons work with reserve, directness, and accuracy, while the young ones, if they work at all, make a much larger but less regulated output of their energy. A few illustrations will make this matter clear. When the button at the upper right-hand corner of the door was first given to number 1, she used to reach down the front of the box while standing on the top and thrust the button with the left paw. After a few trials, she changed. Going around back of the box to the right end and reaching around the corner, she pulled the button towards her with the left paw. Sometimes she would come to the front of the box and thrust the button with the right paw, or with the teeth. Numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 always went to the front of the box. Number 2 used her nose. Number 3 used her right paw and, standing at the left, thrust the button from her. Number 4 and number 5 used both paws, and often teeth and paws. In the case of the bolt at the left of the door, number 1 has always worked it from the top of the box, by reaching down the front and thrusting the bolt to the left with the right paw. This method may have been borrowed from the position first assumed in the case of the button. Number 2 stands in front and a little to the right of the door and thrusts the bolt to the left with the left paw. Number 3 stands at the left end of the box and pulls the bolt towards her with the right paw. Numbers 4 and 5 adopt at different times the method of number 2 or that of number 3. They have never worked from the top of the box thus far. All 5 with practical uniformity now repeat the position and method finally fixed upon whenever the same device is presented, even after intervening periods of days, weeks, or months. When group 2 was given to number 1, she used at the first to open the button at the left by standing at the left end of the box and pulling the button towards her with the right paw. Then she would walk round behind the box to the right end, and reaching the hook with her left paw, pull both hook and button towards her. One variation of this method was to stand in front of the door and thrust the button on the left with the left paw, and the hook and button on the right with the nose. Another variation was standing in front and placing the right paw on the right button, the left paw on the left button, and the nose on the hook, to open all at once. She had made use of the two-paw method in the case of group 1, so that it was but a slight addition to use the nose on the hook. The reason for the use of the nose on the hook came from an earlier experience with it when it was the only lock in use. In attempting to open the door on the 24th trial of the vertical hook series, this animal caught one of her toes between the door and the hook. From that time she adopted the nose method, and after more than a year, with no intervening trial, she still persisted in it. This seems like in character to the action of the coon with the badger as related by Groos, and both show, in contrast to the repetition necessary to perfect the procedure in such things as opening the locks, that certain elements of behavior, probably those that are supported by strong instinctive tendencies, may be determined once for all by a single experience. The same thing appears also in number 3's continued resentment of the blow already referred to, page 461. One of the most interesting and illuminating observations which I have been able to make as to the method by which complicated procedures are perfected is the following. One of the young coons, number 5, was at work on the bear-down lever at the right end of the box. It had just been preceded by the bolt at the left of the door. Although the bolt had been removed, leaving the front of the box smooth, number 5 still devoted his attention to the place where the bolt had previously been, and nearly wore himself out trying to push something from the place where nothing was present. The previous association was too strong to be easily replaced. In the midst of his endeavors, during which he literally rolled over and over in front of the box, he assumed the position of standing on his head. While working in this position, his right hind foot slipped off the top right-hand corner of the box, and striking the lever, pressed it down and opened the box. From the 4th to the 8th trials, he would assume the upside-down position and work at the door until his foot slipped off the corner of the box, depress the lever, and so open the door. His attention, however, was never shifted from the front of the box. Finally, in the midst of his gymnastics, his foot slipped off as usual, but did not strike the bar heavily enough to depress it and open the door, although it remained in contact with it. Distracted by this, he turned and, using his forepaws, thrust the lever down and opened the door. The next day, he was working the lock by slipping his foot from the top of the box to the bar and then turning about and using his forepaws. On the 28th trial of the series, he went directly to the bar and opened the door by thrusting it down, but he still sat down on his haunches, placed his hind foot on the lever, and then assisted with the forepaws. It is fair to assume that in course of time something more easy than this awkward performance would have taken its place. Probably in the end the depressing of the lever with both forepaws, or even the right one alone, but the final steps in the short-circuiting were cut off by number 5's untimely death. The above seems like a case of stimulus having to beat out its path over an unblazed trail in a nerve wilderness. It is typical, however, of much of the learning of animals, and indeed in a measure of all learning, where the way is not opened up by hereditary predisposition or expert instruction. Repetition of imperfectly adapted movements brings about a final happy accident. Many rehearsals of the activities leading up to this follow. Continued practice, in ways not altogether clear as yet, leads to the gradual elimination of the extra movements. The unessential parts of the process are slowed away, and the essential solidified. The steps by which perfection is reached are very short and blindly taken, the new habit arising by slight successive modifications of one already in existence. Perception of the essential relations, if present at all, is dull and stupid to the last degree. Restated from the beginning, it would seem that the smell of the food, intensified by the complex mental activity of curiosity, in some manner lets loose a surplus discharge of motor activity. This sooner or later leads by accident to an agreeable result and a consequent emphasis upon the nervous tract then in action. In this particular case, that underlying the association between the position with the hind foot on the lever and the opening of the door. When this position alone happens to be insufficient, the forepaws are brought to assist as the readiest means for that purpose, the members most responsive to any need of that character. So far, our Raccoon had gone. Footnote. On this general matter, see the paper of Dr. Meltzer, number 22 of the bibliography at the end of this paper. Burke, 8, enumerates the chief accessory lines of development that distinguish human movements as such as 1. The breaking up of old bilateral and simultaneous tendencies characteristic of central movements. 2. The growth of independent movements of smaller parts that previously only moved in conjunction with larger wholes. 3. The coordination of various series to form long and complex sequences as we finally find them illustrated by writing, sewing, piano playing, etc. 4. The development of precision and accuracy. And finally, 5. The response of different movements to a great variety of different stimuli. These all seem to find a ready illustration in the development of animal activity as well as in the child, although in the former case they may be placed on a somewhat lower level. Number 1's experience with combinations 1 and 2 furnishes material of similar significance. As before stated, the locks of the combinations were not uniformly adjusted as to the force necessary to operate them, page 465. Reference to Table 1 shows the 2 chief sources of error, and the average number of errors per trial in groups of 10. Thus, 4.6 is the average number of errors, in order, made in the first 10 trials on combination 1, and 8.5 is the average number of errors of force applied in the first 10 trials on combination 1. Lines 3 and 4 give similar results for combination 1 after a period of 286 days, with no intervening trial. Lines 5 and 6 give results for combination 2, as lines 1 and 2 give them for combination 1. The table seems to show that the memory of the order is more readily perfected than that of the muscular adjustment required for each particular locking device. It would seem as though the order was something that could become definitely fixed, while the muscular adjustment could proceed only to the point of pulling till something gave way. The reduction of errors in order is perhaps more uniform and less erratic than that of errors of applied force. Table 1. Relative proportions of errors in order and errors in force in working the combination locks. And here is a table of numbers I am not going to read. It is highly significant that the order was a constant quantity throughout the entire series of trials with each combination, while the force necessary to move any individual part of the combination was never quite the same. Proper coordination and development of precision and accuracy finally appear, however, so that once the proper conditions are given for the starting of a series of movements, they then follow with due force as well as in proper sequence. In this connection, number 1's method of working the plug is also interesting. When the plug was first given, the method was to stand on the top of the box and pull out the plug with the teeth. The paws were often used to assist while in this position. After the first 10 trials, she discovered that she could stand in front of the box and reach up and pull the plug out with her teeth. A few more trials changed the method to standing in front of the box and reaching up behind the plug and jerking it out with the left paw. After this final method became settled, the animal used to come to the front of the box, sit up and place her paw behind the plug, look around in a seemingly careless fashion, and jerk the plug out without giving any special attention to the process. It was almost as if she would think the device too easy to need anything more than a passing notice. Some such explanation may be plausible for different characters present in the learning curves, yet to be considered. Cole, 10, found with his raccoons, contrary to Thorndike's experience with the cats, that the animals never began work at parts of the box where fastenings had previously been, but went at once to the place of the fastening then in use. The raccoons did not paw at the place where the loop had been, nor did they claw at the loop or button when the door was open. I tried moving the loop from place to place in the boxes. Not once even did they claw where it had been. Instead, they attacked it at the new place with one direct movement. The trials of my coon number 5 with the bear-down lever, during which he worked with so much energy at the place where the bolt had been, as described above, point in exactly the opposite way and lead me to think that Cole's results must be exceptional. My number 3, an old coon, the mother of number 5, also behaved in a way to lead to a similar conclusion. After she had pushed back the vertical hook and the door had sprung open, she used to sit in front of the box, pull on the hook, and then look inside to see if there was any more food. It was rather humorous to see her repeat this performance again and again. Later she dropped it and has never shown a like tendency since. Whether she gave evidence here of a perception of simple relations, as this hook gives food, which later changed to this hook and hole do not give food, may be open to question. When, however, the door was fastened and food placed inside, she never refused to work this lock. The above does not seem to differ much from the habits of the wild. The animal certainly senses certain conditions as indicative of food, and certain others as indicative of no food. The resulting associations persist and strengthen themselves in the first case. The latter cease to stimulate. Old coons soon discover the difference in pulling at the long or the short arm of a lever, as in the button, while the young coon will work indifferently on the long or the short arm, just as it happens to attack the device. It seems sometimes as if there were a kind of intelligent husbanding of energy, which shows itself with age. The tremendous output of energy in youth may be necessary to proper growth and the acquisition of experience, and possibly its numerous errors are thus intimately connected with the learning process. In the working of Combination 1, Raccoon number 1 reached the arbitrary standard of 10 perfect performances in trials 98 to 107. In the case of combination 2, the standard was reached in trials 125 to 134. Since the first learning of the order, some variation has occurred in the animal's working of the locks in combination 1, all, however, in the direction of economy. The bear-down lever is now often opened by stepping on it with the hind foot as the animal mounts to the top of the box for the plug, and the button and hook on the front are usually opened by one movement of the right paw. This activity is similar in character to that of number 5, already described on page 467. Number 1 is shown in the act of doing this very thing in figure 9, plate 2. The tendency to short-circuit is clear again in this instance. In the tests with the combination locks, an opportunity occurred for noticing the persistence of certain impressions and the signal importance of making no false step in training. In the first 15 trials on combination 1, the number of errors was comparatively few. During the next 3 trials, it was discovered that while the combination was a perfect working mechanism if worked forward, an accidental reversal of the first element, the bear-down lever, would lock the box again. The animal did this very thing once, and after the device had been so arranged as to make its repetition impossible, more than 50 trials were necessary to bring the errors down again to the level of the first 15 trials. Fogging an animal in this manner while under training will obviously play havoc with figures and render the results difficult of interpretation. Combination 2 had as one of its elements what is known at the hardware dealers as an inside blind catch, with which the Raccoon had had no previous experience. It proved, however, no more difficult than other parts of the combination. The animal seems to have attained to a sort of generalized behavior with regard to fastenings, which made small differences of little consequence. After the 2 combinations had been learned perfectly, the Raccoon would work them indifferently. If she were given 1 or 2 trials on combination 1 and then it was replaced by combination 2, the animal never made the mistake of beginning on the apparatus as if it were the other. In view of the fact that the 2 combination boxes were not exactly of the same dimensions and differed somewhat in color, there is little doubt that this difference sufficed to touch off in each case through the association centers the proper order and relation of movements for the particular combination presented. The animal tends strongly to approach the boxes from one direction only. If this avenue of approach is blocked up, a new adjustment to the new condition will, of course, take place, but the old fastening from a new side presents about the same difficulty as a new fastening.